Welcome to Fundamentally Different, the podcast that Capacity hosts to explore bold ideas about reshaping how we think about public services. In today's episode, we'll delve into the complex but crucial challenge of neighbourhood improvement and why true regeneration must start with the people who live there. Across the UK, doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods are struggling, grappling with the deep-rooted deprivation and fragile social infrastructure. But solutions are emerging. 3NI is working at the intersection of local government, public services and resident leadership to drive lasting, meaningful change where it's needed the most. To help us unpack what makes neighbourhood regeneration really work and what still is holding it back, we're joined by three brilliant guests. Madeleine Jennings, Director of Policy and Communication at Local Trust, the organisation behind the pioneering Big Local programme and the incubator of 3NI. Dan Crowe, Director of 3NI, who previously shaped policy for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Left Behind Neighbourhoods, and Stephen Perez, a grassroots community leader with hands-on experience leading local improvement efforts through Big Local. Alongside myself, Emma Lord, Director of Design and Doing at Capacity. Together, we'll explore four key ideas shaping the future of neighbourhood improvement. We'll talk about power to the people, the role of social infrastructure, deeper devolution, and measuring what really works. So stay with us as we explore what gives our guests hope and what still frustrates them, and why neighbourhood-led change could be the key to a fairer, stronger future. So, kicking off around resident-led change, let's kind of start with the principle that neighbourhood improvement must be led by residents themselves and not done to them. Madeleine, why is that so essential? What happens when local people are in the driving seat and what still gets in their way?
So I think what's most important from a big local point of view is that residents, communities in their neighbourhoods know what needs to be done. They know better than the local authority. They certainly know better than central government what problems they're facing and what solutions are going to work for them. I think that's really, really important. It's not a one-size-fits-all program. The Big Local is all about handing over not just funding and decision-making, but identifying the relevant solutions and supporting communities to put those in place. I think that there are lots of statutory mechanisms around that are designed to enable communities to be heard and to have their say. And those, though fantastic and often really kind of life-changing for communities, aren't necessarily available to those communities that are most disadvantaged around the country. And what really needs to be factored into all of these different mechanisms, whether it's things like neighbourhood planning or philanthropic funding, is that neighbourhoods and communities need time to think first and be given the sort of patient support that allows them to factor in all of the different barriers and work through them at their own pace. So meeting communities where they are.
Thank you. And Stephen, I wonder if maybe you could share an example from Big Local or elsewhere of something that has been really resident-led.
Yeah, I can. I mean, lots of different things. We've sort of, within our area, which is in Chatham, in Medway, in Kent, we created a neighbourhood forum, which led to creating a neighbourhood plan, which went to referendum recently, sort of past referendum. So that was community-led. I think just echo back on Medi's comments around the importance of things being community-led. I think the importance that everybody who's around the table feels valued. And I think this is part of the challenge that we have, is that ultimately, because we can have these mechanisms like neighbourhood plans, which ultimately only have so much power because they sit under the local plan. I think the most important thing is that everybody at the table feels valued and feels part of the process. Because I think this is sometimes a struggle that we have as communities, is that we are looking to lead on the change, which of course is important that we lead on the change, but it's also important that we have the statutory bodies that work alongside us as well. And I think sometimes that's where it can fall down. You end up with situations where those that should give all the responsibilities that those that should be involved, but have none of the power or the expertise to actually push things to where they need to be. But for example, of our neighbourhood plan, absolutely fantastic plan around engagement, huge levels of engagement. Engagement probably it's never been done on a scale like it was done hyper locally. But ultimately, at the end of that process, the plan only has so much ability to affect change. So I think sometimes there's also that around, as Maddie's saying, around time. Things do take time. Time is definitely something that's part of it, but also managing people's expectations, because ultimately a lot of the systems that we are working within, we take the planning as an example of one of them, which has a major effect on people living in sort of deprived areas, is pretty flawed. So whatever you're working with, you're in a real struggle. So you have to manage expectations of people. I think sometimes people get sort of overexcited about what they think may come out of us creating something. Expectations need to be managed. And I think local trust has been really good at, actually, we need to start creating policy change. We need to start changing how these mechanisms work, because it's really hard to be part of something or involved in something if nobody truly understands how it works, even the people that are within it often. So I hope that's useful.
Yeah. Working within the things that are already there, space, time to do that. I'm curious to kind of look a little bit further around making sure people feel valued. Like, what does that look like in practice? And maybe kind of conversely, what does bad look like in practice? And maybe there's some examples you could draw on.
No, definitely. Well, I can give one example. Good does not look like people not listening, banging tables, slamming doors in meetings. That's not good. Good looks like people actively listening and letting people actually finish what it is that they're having, patience and understanding. And also just, I think sometimes, especially when you're dealing with statutory bodies and you're dealing, whether that's council officers, whatever that looks like, is that sometimes they can become very they become threatened, because what they're hearing from people that live in the area doesn't necessarily resonate with the plans that they've got coming forward, or their understanding of how the environment sits. So I think sometimes I guess it's a really, in my experience, for some people, it's a really awkward experience of not feeling in control. Because when you're the people that are in control, you're just used to telling people, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and yeah, that's it. All of a sudden, you're trying to change that dynamic where they have to listen and they have to absorb and they have to reflect. And I think they're the most important things. That's what good looks like. Actively listening, absorbing what's being said and reflecting on it, and not having an instantaneous response of, we can't do that, or, oh my God, no, we wouldn't be allowed to do that. It takes time sometimes to go away from the meetings or those interaction events to go back and say, what did people actually say? What did people actually mean?
Yeah. And the culture of that, how has that changed over the lifetime of your experience of Big Local?
I think it's a two-part. I think it goes back to success. Everybody wants success. Where people see success, they will gravitate towards it. But I think sadly sometimes it's down to when you start to look at the environment, you start to look at the environment in its constituent pieces. Sometimes it's really sort of sad and frustrating that ultimately things don't happen because of a single individual that just doesn't get it. And I think sometimes you have to accept that you have to wait there may be occasions where you have to wait for that individual to move off the board before you can get things done. And I think that it can be quite frustrating. And when you look back at some of the things that we did at the end, we could have done at the beginning, just that nobody would allow us or would have the headspace to do that. So an example of that locally, environmentally, would be around all the street tree planting that we did. We could have done that a lot earlier. It's just, nothing really changed. It's just people's thoughts and minds changed around what was possible and what wasn't possible.
Yeah.
And that can be a bit frustrating, but that's life, isn't it? Things just take a time. Sometimes as well, I think as people, as residents, when we look for the Big Local experience, is that as soon as the brake's taken off, you want to do things as quickly as you possibly can. You're sort of conscious of this clock that's sort of ticking around in the background. So sometimes you do need to be slowed down. Obviously, local trust would play a part in that, and sort of and other areas, and also mechanisms that sort of exist around where you are working. So it's not about just rushing headlong into stuff. Sometimes you do need to be naturally slowed down, but that can be done in a way that's not sending people away. It's just saying, let's do something. Let's do it gradually. Let's not do it at all.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. And Dan, I guess building on what Stephen was saying, we've heard about time, understanding, value, kind of that awkward feeling of relinquishing some control. What other things do you think are holding back communities from being able to be in the lead?
I think following on from that, there's been in some areas where there has been attempted top-down regeneration. So you could look, for example, previous government initiatives such as housing market renewal pathfinders that might have abruptly stopped, leaving areas kind of half finished, leaving promises that have been broken, creating mistrust amongst local residents, creating I was on a panel last week at Stronger Things, and one of the resident projects, one of the people there talked about the trauma that past failed top-down regeneration had created amongst the community, and a sense of mistrust that still prevailed then in terms of dealing with the local authority and the statutory agencies. So I think there's certainly work to be done there in building bridges, in building trust between local residents, between communities, particularly those that the areas that we previously referred to as left behind, or now maybe talk about as being doubly disadvantaged, recognizing that that's still not necessarily a perfect term, but reflecting communities that have been asset stripped, that have had their kind of economic resources and the social infrastructure disappear, that has left them without necessarily the means to engage, that has left them without the confidence or the capacity to take advantage of potential opportunities. So you could look, for example, the community ownership fund. That's great. There's a great mechanism in enabling communities that had the confidence, the skills, the capacity to be able to access taxpayer subsidy to maintain and safeguard and renew community assets in their local area. But for areas that don't necessarily have access to expertise, whether that's legal expertise or technical expertise, to be able to put together submissions or proposals to secure funding, they're not able. It's not a level playing field. So for those communities, I think there needs to be a certain focus and targeted support and investment, as Madeleine had said, over the long term, to enable communities themselves to build that capacity, to build that confidence, so that they're able to be in the driving seat, able to take action on the priorities that matter most for them. It's not something that can be a top-down endeavour. It's got to be a bottom-up process led by local residents themselves.
Yeah. Nice segue there, Dan. Social infrastructure, a few of you have used that terminology, the glue of community life, against kind of the backdrop of the talk around levelling up and big economic growth projects that sometimes miss the role of social infrastructure. I just wondered, Dan, if you could, when we say that, what do we mean, and why does it matter to neighbourhoods?
That's a good question. So 3NI, we're using the definition of social infrastructure that local trust pioneered and developed, and that's we're talking there about civic assets. So the places and spaces in a community that bring a community together, that enable people to meet and to organise, that underpin civic associational life. We're talking about the groups and the networks, the levels of civic engagement and participation in a local area, in a community. And we're also talking about connectivity, both digital and physical connectivity to enable connections to other places and to services and to opportunities. Some of the things that many of us might take for granted living in the neighbourhoods that we live in. So that's local trust also. I mean, in terms of using the community needs index to provide a quantitative measure of social infrastructure, local trust did an amazing amount of work on that, and we're taking that forward. Claire and I, we're using that in our engagements and discussions with local government and other public sector partners. And the key there is the key importance of social infrastructure. This is learning from the Big Local program and some of the origins there, and that when Big Local, when things got going, it was noticed that in those areas that had low levels of social infrastructure, it was harder to get things off the ground. It was harder to engage people, and then through recent foundational research, to cut a long story short, when we overlaid the community needs index that mapped and measured social infrastructure with the index of multiple deprivation, we found that in areas that were not just socioeconomically deprived as measured by the IMD, and which figured in the 10% most deprived under that index, but also had high levels of community need and low levels of social infrastructure as measured by the community needs index, residents in those areas experienced worse outcomes compared not only to national or to regional averages, but also to similarly and equally deprived areas, pointing to the importance of social infrastructure there. And you can look into what happened during COVID and the significantly lower rate of success in attracting COVID-specific charitable funding, for example, in these left behind or doubly disadvantaged areas, or in terms of lower concentrations of mutual age groups that were established and in response to the pandemic. That all points to the importance of social infrastructure, and most importantly, social infrastructure's role as an engine or a factory of producing social capital. And a 3MI local trust have been doing a lot of work this year, revisiting the importance of social capital in a way that's been increasingly picked up by government, who in the introduction to the government's Plan for Neighbourhoods prospectus, they referenced our research, the importance of social capital and its role in improving outcomes, whether that's economic outcomes or health and well-being outcomes in a local area. And also, really good news, we saw last week the strategy on dormant assets that was published by Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and that referenced the importance of social capital there, and that the Community Wealth Fund would be explicitly targeted at areas that were deprived, doubly disadvantaged, using the language that we've been talking about, and that would be focused on areas with low levels of social capital. Again, recognising the importance there of supporting grassroots social infrastructure.
Okay, so policymakers are kind of prioritising social infrastructure. It's on the agenda. Madeleine, do you think policymakers really understand the value of social infrastructure and are kind of confident in improving it?
To be honest, I think it's a mixed bag. I think that some policymakers are starting to see the benefits of it. I think especially those members of parliament who represent areas with high numbers of doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods, so those neighbourhoods that are both highly materially deprived but also lack crucial social infrastructure. And I think that we've started to develop and contribute to quite a wide and convincing bank of evidence in favour of investment in social infrastructure as a real driver of national growth, and the importance of bringing all of these doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods sort of with the rest of the country when it comes to improvements in employment and skills. So that's something that we're starting to see. Our recent report with Frontier Economics, which was a sort of a revisiting of previous work that had estimated the return on investment for social infrastructure at £3.2 for every £1 invested. That's now been updated to £3.6 for every pound, which makes a really good, solid case for investing in social infrastructure as being sort of almost about more than the individual neighbourhoods that will benefit. There's a bigger story here, and that is something that we are certainly talking to policymakers about, and hopefully today's spending review will recognise that. But I think it's also worth noting that at the moment, the government's working definition of social infrastructure is prisons, schools and hospitals, which are necessary. They're really important, but they're not what we think of as social infrastructure. Dan gave us the definition there from the Community Needs Index, which is what we focus on. And, it's the real things that make a community, isn't it? It's having somewhere to meet so you can have a conversation about what you want. And without that place to meet, those conversations aren't happening. I recently went to a big local just outside Runcorn, Windmill Hill, an estate built in the 70s, which they were given a community centre that was supposed to be a temporary measure. It was 2 bungalows knocked together. There's not a single room in this building where more than 10 people can be at one time. It's still their community centre, or it was until the big local came along and enabled the community to take over the local church, which is operated as a church, but that's almost secondary to the fact that it's now a community cafe and the only space big enough for everybody to get together in that area, which is, I suppose, typical of a lot of big locals in that it's situated in what might be termed an overspill estate on the edge of a town, and not as well connected or as well integrated with services and big site leisure facilities as it might be. So that's really important. And I also think about a webinar that I recently participated in with a whole load of young people. And the idea was to kind of stress test our quite theoretical definitions of social infrastructure and social capital. What does that actually mean to, the future generation of decision makers and just kind of residents of communities? And I think that the examples of social infrastructure that were given in that session really surprised me, although they make perfect sense in the retelling. But things like the local newsagent was really important to these young people. They go in the morning on the way to school, and they go back in on the way back from school. It's where they shelter from the cold and the rain, which isn't home, crucially. Their parents aren't there, but there was an adult there supervising, making sure trouble doesn't kick off. And it's somewhere familiar and comforting where they can exchange stories and develop community ties. I think that's really, really telling.
Great. So we've tried to unpack what we mean by social infrastructure and social capital. And thanks, Madeleine. That really brings to life what we mean by it. And I wonder, Stephen, if you could add to that, through the work that you've been doing in Kent, what would people give as examples of social infrastructure, and how have you been trying to drive that up in the area that you live in?
Yeah, it's really interesting. With regards to our area, I think it's really interesting when you use all the different terms that I use, sort of around doubly disadvantaged, left behind, and all. It's trying to sort of add a really simple sort of name to something that's really complicated. I think when we look at our area, like we don't have, there's no social infrastructure, formal social infrastructure around sort of community centres. What we do have is lots of, there's some churches, there's some green spaces. The other challenge we have is just that though it's a deprived area, just land values are just immense. So people just buy stuff and do nothing with it because it just makes an income naturally. So there's a real sort of there's a real sort of lack of actually what can you do. It's all, it sounds great in the sense around policy and saying that we're going to do this and do that, but when the land is owned by so many people that really have no sort of intention to do anything with it, that brings those challenges. But one of the things that we did look at, and I think I definitely agree with what everybody was saying around the pace of change and the lack of social infrastructure and the effect that has. And we certainly felt that because we took quite a long time in sort of creating our plan. But one of the things that we did focus on, which we did have a certain amount of influence upon, even though we didn't necessarily own it, was our green spaces, so our parks. So we sort of put lots of time and effort and funding into sort of regenerating those as places where people could meet. And I think this is going back to that. I think there's people. I mean, it's really interesting hearing about the newsagent, because that's certainly something I would have sort of resonated with me when I was growing up, around those sort of locations. But I think also sometimes it's because there's just a devoid of anything else. So we start to create things, and we start to think that they're good as well, when they're not necessarily that great, but just when you've got nothing else to sort of measure them against, they feel good. And I think this is what happens in those areas, like our area where all the pubs are closed. There's very few places to meet. A lot of the green space has been built upon. It's naturally crept up on people, so people just don't see it as being odd. It's only when you start to go to other areas that you realise it's odd. But we spent a lot of time investing in our parks and our built environment, which to create a situation where people could come and meet. I've also understanding when you're living in such hard and toxic environments around how they look, that also changes how people frequent through them. They're in a rush. They're generally not wanting to speak to anybody. So softening that, whether that's through murals, whether that's through tree planting, whether that's through sort of creating making the green spaces a little bit more nicer so people want to walk through and want to spend time in them. Naturally, that then creates those social connections that people will have. And we've certainly seen that, I think we were having this conversation about what good looks like and how you measure it and all that, and around those subjects. And I think sometimes it's trying to measure the unmeasurable when we look at around the impact that social infrastructure has. But I think sometimes what we can look from a big local perspective is we can look at other areas within that hyper local area that didn't have big local, and the areas that did have big local. And where you look at our area, though people would look at it and say, it has its challenges, it's not got progressively worse. It's kind of sort of slowed down, and in many parts got a lot better. And when you look at areas that sit outside of it, they have got progressively worse. It's not a rocket scientist to work out that having areas that look nice, having places where people can meet and interact in a positive fashion. So I think this is the important thing about it. Having somewhere to meet isn't necessarily, you could say the job centre is a great place to meet, but I can imagine my sort of journeys for the job centre, people aren't in a particularly great headspace. So thinking about how we design this social infrastructure is really important as well. And I think that's where when we look at our green space and why they've been a success, is because residents have led on what has happened and how they look and how they feel. And that may not be the A standard. That may not be the architectural sort of, the horticultural sort of best way of doing things.
It could be the newsagent.
People wanted. It could be the newsagent. Yeah, let's brighten the newsagent up. Let's plant a tree outside it, which is exactly what we did in our area outside the school. So, there's things that we can do it doesn't have to be the natural fit. And I think sometimes we're trying to force things on people, and it isn't necessarily what they want or need.
Yeah. So I get, like, what I'm hearing really loudly is the power of the environment, and how can we create places for connection. We kind of clarified what we mean about social infrastructure, and thank you for those examples that really bring it to life around what it means. I think another word that we've used quite a lot is neighbourhood. And Dan, I just wonder, what does that mean?
I think the starting point here, I mean, that's a good question, isn't it? For some working in the NHS, it means population of footprint of 50,000 or maybe even upwards of that. Whereas we've got to be talking about natural, meaningful neighbourhoods that the people that live there kind of relate to and identify with. So it's not using artificial statistical geography. It's not top down, whether that's local, combined authority or central government saying this is your neighbourhood and this is where, this is what we will be proposing to do there. It's got to be reflecting those areas where people live, the streets, their surrounding environment, the places that they call home. So that's the starting point there. And even when we use our data diagnostic tool Discovery, which is predicated on identifying the dimensions and drivers of community need at the lower layer, super output area level, so really hyper local, when we produce aggregates of that data, the caveat there is always going to be, well, you have to supplement and complement that with qualitative research in the community itself, involving local people, involving local residents, and it's up to it should be up to communities themselves to help identify the areas that they're referring to as their neighbourhood. So there's that. If you look at what some of the evidence and the research suggests, some of the work, some of the foundational work suggests that local trust commissions areas of around a population 10,000, maybe around that mark. I believe the average big local residential kind of catchment was about 7,500. So that's the sort of hyperlocal scale we're talking about. Although even saying that, one of a really great project that we've been engaged with, well, local trust was engaged with through the Creative Civic Change programme, and that I've been working with through colleagues in the city of Stoke-on-Trent is the Portland Inn project, and I believe that's around 500 homes there. So a much smaller, granular area, but very, very specific neighbourhood that again people identify with, and there's a kind of meaning there. There's a real able sense of belonging, and it's at that spatial level where it's important to. It's at that spatial level where the social bonds and the trusts and the relationships and the networks are able to form. So, for example, another example here is the creation, the idea, the conceptualization of the Community Wealth Fund was always conceived at being targeted at that population level, ward level, 10,000 population around that. And we're still waiting the results of the government's response to the initial technical consultation there, because previously the footprint had shifted, and it was there had been talk, this was from the last government, that it would be targeted at small towns of a population of around 20,000, less than 20,000, which wouldn't enable us to really gain the benefits from that capacity building, from supporting that grassroots social infrastructure, from taking the asset-based development approach to build social capital, to build up trust and networks and relationships. And it's only at the hyperlocal level where that is really going to be fruitful.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Madeleine, I imagine you're kind of swimming in different definitions of neighbourhoods, dependent on who you're working with. Is that a problem, and why?
So I don't think it's a problem. I think neighbourhoods are how you feel. It's about relationships and how far relationships can go. And we know that regeneration and community development works best where relationships are at the core of it, and the driving energy is that real local knowledge. And that can only spread so far. But obviously, if you're looking at a rural area, and if there are a lot of big locals that are 3 or 4 villages near each other in a rural area, that's a very different looking neighbourhood to an estate in the inner city, which will be another sort of self-contained geographical version of the neighbourhood. Interestingly, the Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods came out with a report late last year that tried to do some polling around the definition of neighbourhoods and what people felt neighbourhoods were to them. And it seems that the higher up the socioeconomic scale you are, the more likely you are to give an expansive definition of your neighbourhood. So the whole town, a whole city. And the lower down the scale, the more likely you are to limit your definition of your neighbourhood to your own estate, or to a sort of handful of buildings. And obviously that partly is to do with affluence and whether or not you can afford to roam around a larger area and choose what shops you want to go to, choose what schools you want to go to, choose what healthcare you're going to receive, which are all components that create an experience of neighbourhood. So we don't have an answer, but I think we do feel strongly that it is about the elasticity of relationships and how far they can stretch in order to do the work that needs to get done and get people on board.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. It's neighbourhood. It are the relationships you have and the connections that you can make. And I guess, it is a word that is being used by lots of different people. And so, that feels really true and honest and real. And then at the other side, you've got people trying to scale work with the right intentions. But I guess when something is so fuzzy and grey, what might happen in that space?
So I suppose it brings us back to the big local principles and the reason our programme was designed the way it has been designed. And I think I said before about meeting communities where they are. We have 150 areas and 1 million goes to each area. That's a fairly large programme. It is the largest programme of its kind since the New Deal for Communities in the early noughties. And so it's by no means sort of small scale, but it is bespoke and it is specific to those areas, and boundaries were drawn up at the outset of the programme according to more or less what was appropriate to that area and what was sort of commonly felt to be the area by the community. So I think it is possible to operate in that fuzzy area, but it takes will, and it takes I suppose, an element of risk enthusiasm, which is obviously not always there, but can be found. And I think the government's new announcement about its test and learn approach and taking inspiration from the tech world and allowing themselves space to get it wrong and fail and try again is a really interesting lesson that we could apply to this sort of work.
Great. Yeah. Let's try the things that we think might work, and if they don't, how can we learn from it? Stephen, is that something that's felt real in the work in Kent?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because our experience of Big Local when it came was that we were given an area that really didn't really make any sense, if I'm being brutally honest with you, because it sort of had it had two constituent parts, which was separated by a major road and a very complex roundabout called the Arches. One side was abjectly poverty, and there was lots of parts of it that no one lived in, and the other part was also deprived, but sort of mostly Victorian housing. So it didn't really make a lot of sense around how it shaped, how it was. We weren't part of that conversation either, so it wasn't, nobody came and said. But actually, on reflection, that was probably a bit of a blessing, because ultimately what happens with a lot of these areas is that they're defined by their history and people's perceptions of them. So there's a lot of stigmas, a lot of stereotypes of living in certain areas. Whereas actually, I think we found because it wasn't a natural neighbourhood, because it wasn't. When you separate something with a big roads intersection, even though it's in an urban area, people just don't travel very far. They sort of take the path of least resistance. If there's a big road there, they're going to turn left, they're not going to go right. But actually, it was a bit of a benefit because of the stereotypes and stigmas that arrived in the area, we were actually able to define our own neighbourhood, which was the Arches local neighbourhood. And even when within that, we redefined that neighbourhood, I think, midway through the process as well. So we took in another area which actually was completely different to all the others. So we had 3 constituent parts that were different. But I think there is something in that, because I think ultimately when we're drawing these lines, we do tend to draw them around, we like it to be the same. Let's have everybody the same that lives in the circle or lives in the area. And I think from what we've heard already and what we know around sort of social capital is that having mixtures of people, whether that's sort of economic levels, education levels, is really important, because you can start to pull in those, as we spoke about earlier on, those expertise, those job roles that may not exist in certain communities. So the only challenge would be that the people that are living in the more affluent area might not want to be badged with the people who are living in the less affluent area. But ultimately, I think there's a massive value around defining neighbourhoods differently. Let's just forget, and that's what happened with Arches. We were able to forget all the negative elements and we redefined ourselves, and it really did help getting things done, because it just looked and felt different, and also for the people that lived there as well. All of a sudden, they weren't necessary. They were, like we spoke about, being quite narrow in the sense of where you defined yourself from. All of a sudden, you had a bit of a wider spectrum to that. So yeah, I think, as we see with the Big Local process, because you're doing 150 areas over such a lot, you've got so many different types of rural, urban, towns, villages. It's really difficult to try and draw a map around it. Ours worked. It shouldn't have done, but it did because we made it work. We used the negatives to our advantage. Nobody knew what it was. Fantastic. Let's use that.
Yeah, great. So it sounds like you lent into that ambiguity and created the kind of purpose and the focus with and between yourselves. And Stephen, that is an elegant segue into, what really counts, what is success. So I wonder whether, Madeleine, I come to you first for kind of the bird's eye view of, what are the indicators and the signs that tell us that things are genuinely turning a corner, whilst keeping our feet firmly on the ground, that is really different for every place, every person.
Yes, I'm gonna start sounding predictable, but it is, as you say, what is right for that area and what they perceive to be success and define as their priorities. So Big Local was very intentionally light on reporting and not driven by set outcomes and a sort of percentage point ability to get close to those outcomes, as previous programs have been, and I think have been sort of evaluated as not having worked as well as a result, because that energy is diverted to hitting targets that aren't necessarily what the community would like to see. However, there has been enough evidence now, both from Big Local, but also programs like the New Deal for Communities and others, that shows that a wide range of benefits come from neighbourhood level initiatives. Things like well-being benefits, a sense of improved mental health, which studies show seems to be linked to that sense of agency, both individual but also collective efficacy, the belief that together as a group, people can change what they don't like. But then there's also work that Dan's been doing with 3NI to look at the changes over time in a neighbourhood that has received a neighbourhood intervention and areas that haven't. And there's some great stuff coming out of that about reduced crime rates. And perhaps Dan would like to pick that one up because it's very much his area of work.
Dan, over to you.
Yeah. There's certainly some benefit there to looking at progress against indicators, for example, relating to crime, to antisocial behaviour, to criminal damage. Some of the environmental and public realm measures that I guess Stephen was talking to about how people feel about their local area. So we've certainly got some quant measures we could look at. There's the sort of indicators that the New Deal for Community looked at. I believe something like 32 out of the 36 that they used showed positive change, or change in a kind of positive trajectory, and quite a number of them being statistically significant. Some of the research that we're hoping to publish at the end of this month, at the start of the next month, also shows statistical significance in terms of improvements around the crime and social behaviour, some of the stuff around the economy as well, and around maybe around children and that kind of family environment. So we can measure that, and I think it's also important that perhaps most importantly of all is that we are local people in terms of their priorities and the things that they value, the things that they consider important, how we can pick up and demonstrate a shift in the dial in terms of meeting their needs and their aspirations at that hyperlocal level.
Thanks, Dan. And Stephen, I wonder if you, at the start of your Big Local, had some ideas about what success might look like, and maybe there was some attention given to those. And I guess now, however many years down the line you are, what are the real indicators of success? And if we could track back and track that, that we can't go back in time, but I wonder what your anticipated impact might be, and then in reality, what do you really think the impact has been?
Take us back in time.
Great.
Not virtually. I think there has to be a baseline of understanding when you're in a community where nothing, and I mean nothing, is happening. In other words, people aren't in control of anything. People don't feel in control of anything. People just feel like stuff is being done to them, or stuff is just happening and they have no influence over it. People's idea around what success might look like is very limited. So for example, we asked some simple questions. What would you like? What don't you like? And what would you like to change? And it was really interesting around that, because things that people liked were things that we talked about, close to schools, close to my friends, close to neighbours. Things that people didn't like were crime, feeling unsafe, the look and feel of the area, all the negatives. What was interesting around change, people say less dog poo. You go, is that it? And I used to think, why are we so limiting? And I think part of it, when I used to have conversations, was that people just wanted they wanted success.
Yeah.
They just felt that maybe that was achievable. Reducing the amount of drug taking that was going on, drug sales, general fluid area, felt like just something that was insurmountable. So people were very sort of scaled back on what they wanted, what they perceived the future would look like. Because as we've spoken about, this has all been done before. These areas have just been done to so many times. Of course, yes, this looked and felt different at the beginning. When you're in those inceptual stages, it still feels that way. And I think also we sort of become the mechanisms that don't work to start with as well. And we sort of rapidly realised that was not a good look. We needed to do things differently. When we're talking about change, people want to change. I mean, one of the most stark and saddest things where people say, "I'd like to leave." You say, "No, but you'd like to change about the area?" "Yeah, me not being in this area anymore."
Yeah,
that was one of the things that people spoke about. So that was quite stark. What does success look like? I think sometimes I think there is that challenge around how we measure the unmeasurable. How people feel, and also just in certain areas like urban areas where people are moving and changing all the time. So what does success look like? Because those people that were involved in that project no longer live in the area anymore. Those people that did that felt that impact of that holiday program, they're no longer there. So that's hard to measure, and that's why the environment is something that we need to unpick, because a lot of times it drives that behaviour. But what success looks like, I think it's just doing stuff. Are we still doing stuff? Are we still doing stuff? And if we're not, why not? And I think that's part of that. And it would be great if we could go back, if we could go into the future and we could start again. I think that's one of those things. And I think certainly in those areas where things are moving so rapidly, people are coming in and out of areas so rapidly, it's really hard to measure. But throughout the whole program, we asked those questions, and what we found as time went on, people were more honest. They were more honest about what they wanted, what they didn't like, and what they would like to change. And all of a sudden, that sort of changed what we were doing. We were more adventurous about what we wanted to do. We were more grand. Some of the things didn't necessarily come into fruition, but we were creating that excitement. We were creating that sort of positivity, and that took, that took maybe 3-4 years, if we're being brutally honest, about moving from a place where there was nothing to where there was something. So I think don't underestimate the time that it takes for people to build that trust and build that belief. But yeah, so and then they just reflected within our plans, and they were grand. We sort of did lots of sort of various, from sort of large scale street art to sort of, like we talked about, urban regeneration, creating, probably the first neighbourhood plan in an area like ours. Lots of different things, big programs, little things as well. Getting people into rehab. That you bump into the street now and they sort of say their lives have changed because of those interactions. So it can be microscopically small, and it can be very large, and everyone sees it all the day. It will feel different to different people.
What feels loud to me there, Stephen, is keep doing stuff.
Yeah, keep doing stuff.
Whatever that stuff is, just keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I'd just love to hear from each of you around what gives you hope when you think about neighbourhood regeneration. Madeleine, I'll come to you first.
So we take a lot of officials and ministers and parliamentarians, as well as other charities and think tanks, along on big local visits as often as we can, really, without sort of overloading residents and partnership boards. But for me, it's the look on the faces of people who we've been trying to convince for a long time with reports and stats, even case studies. It's the look on their face when they start chatting to big local partnership members, to volunteers, when they see it in action, when they see on the ground the difference that really sometimes very small interventions by the community is making. That look is what gives me hope, because I know that even the most hard bitten are convincible, and that it can be done, and that the big local provides an incredible showcase for that type of work to continue. So yeah, that's the one for me.
The look on people's faces when all of those papers are converted into reality. Great, thanks, Madeleine. Dan, what's giving you hope?
Yeah, I mean, to echo that, it's the pioneering examples and success demonstrated by these 150 amazing big local partnerships across England. There's their legacy. It's the work of Icon Independent Commission of Neighbourhoods and the research and the policy suggestions that they're producing at the minute. And it's conversations with officers from local government, and increasingly noticeable the language that central government is using, and we'll be hearing within the next hour, say, if any, where government might be going, if anywhere, with a neighbourhoods agenda. So I think lots of reasons to be hopeful.
Okay, so it's on more and more agendas. Great. And last but by absolute not least, Stephen, what is keeping you hopeful?
I think just people in general. I think, spending time with people and just seeing how people can sort of provide and survive in what are particularly sort of difficult and challenging environments. And I think the thing that gives me hope is that this is the answer. I just think it's really sad that we're taking so long to sort of gravitate towards it, but actually involving people, devolving power and influence to people, that is the only pathway, that is the only route. It's just how long do we want to drag our feet sort of getting to it? But ultimately what we've seen from big local is that it does work. It also doesn't work as well. But ultimately, even with the elements that didn't work, we brought something from it. We took something from it. I think we've spent so long being so disassociated from everything that's going on. Being involved even when it doesn't work, we take collective responsibility to then make it work. So I think what gives me hope is that it's just inevitable. I think let's not drag our feet sort of getting along to it. Let's start to think about how we can sort of scale up, whether it's with the Community Wealth Fund, the learnings that we took from big local, and trusting people. Trust people. That's the most important thing. No matter where they're from, who they are, where they are, what they're doing, is we just need to put more trust in people, because we can get it right.
Yeah. The people know. In an effort to try and sum up, we've covered a fair amount of ground there. The things that felt loud to me were patience. These things take time, but also we're running out of patience to start doing more of this. So, on both sides, patience and impatience. This can feel awkward. And we've got to create the spaces for people to lean in and be supported with that awkwardness and that uncertainty. And we don't know what's going to work, but we've got enough evidence to tell us that leaning on the principles of believing in people, giving them time, creating spaces for them to lead decision making will work. Things will go wrong, but more often than not, things work. And those don't always need to be big ticket changes. It is the small things that are enabling people to feel more connected, and the then knock-on impact of that are the bigger ticket things like crime, antisocial behaviour, health outcomes. there's lots of language in this space that you can easily kind of trip up on, but trying to kind of boil that down into the simplicity of what it really means, but also accept that they're all wholly ambiguous, and not to get too kind of caught up in what do we really mean by this, and until we can be certain about what we mean, we can't possibly move forward. But I guess language is important, but let's not stop us acting. And the thing that there's kind of been threaded throughout it for me has been trust, and how can we create as many spaces to build trust in the places that possibly distrust other people the most, and that being people that are paid to be helping people, and everyone in between. So I think that's it for today's episode of Fundamentally Different. It just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Madeleine, Stephen and Dan for your time in taking part in such a great conversation. To check out more about the work that we do at Capacity, and for more information about our guests, you can find all of that in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to more Fundamentally Different podcasts that you can find on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.